Welcome back to Waters Iron Works. It is a hot day here in Central Texas, and I have been hauling some anvils around, so a little bit tired this afternoon, but wanted to take a look at three different anvils folks in the Pioneer Farms blacksmithing community have. They're all three Trenton Anvils, and I thought we'd talk a little bit about the history of Trenton Anvils and take a look at each of these three examples. We've got three different sizes, all made within the same few years, and I'll show you how to figure all of that out. There's a couple questions too as we go through this that are outstanding questions about Trenton Anvils, and I'll toss those out there to see if anybody has any information on it. A lot of the information that we're going to be covering in this video comes from Anvils in America by Richard Postman. This is the definitive anvil book for U.S. anvils. If you've got a U.S. anvil and you want to learn more about it, this is the book to go get. But let me set that aside. We'll talk a little bit about, like I said, the history of Trenton anvil manufacturing, and then we'll look at the specifics on each of these three anvils. All right, so I've got my notes written down here, so I'll be looking at those just to make sure I get all the dates and everything right. But I want to walk you through the history of Trenton Anvils and what made them so special and how they really took the anvil world by storm, and why they're called Trenton Anvils, because they weren't produced in Trenton, New Jersey. They were actually produced in Columbus, Ohio, and that became a point of contention with Fisher and Norris, whose Eagle anvils were actually produced in Trenton, New Jersey. Fisher and Norris would go on to run ads about get an authentic Trenton anvil, make sure that you're asking for Eagle. So there was some contention between these two companies. If you'd like to see that ad or some of the other ads that I'm going to talk about as we go through this, I'll have a link to my website where I've got some images of all of those that you can take a look at, as well as some more details. So let's answer that first question. Why is an anvil made in Columbus, Ohio called a Trenton anvil? And it's actually a pretty simple answer. There was originally a company called Trenton Vice and Tool Works that was located in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were selling anvils under the Trenton brand. In the 1888 range, maybe a little bit earlier as well. These anvils were not being produced by Trenton Vice and Tool Works, and they were probably not being produced in the US at all. They were likely imported from England or Germany and then being branded as Trenton Anvils for Trenton Vice and Tool Works. Well, in the late 1890s, Trenton Vice and Tool Works, which was a subsidiary of H. Boker Company, who's actually still around. I believe they're selling knives these days. But the Trenton Vice Company went out of business, stopped producing anything, and about that same time, H. Boker and Company becomes the sales reps for the newly founded Columbus Forge and Iron Company. And we don't know all the details, but it's pretty easy to assume that H. Boker and Company says, look, you guys are going to start selling anvils. We've got an established anvil brand that is already out there. We can bring that value to the partnership. So rather than trying to come up with your own branding that people aren't going to recognize, let's go with the Trenton Anvil brand. Columbus Forge Company says, sounds great. And so we start getting anvils forged in Columbus, Ohio that are branded under Trenton with that original Trenton, New Jersey history coming to it. These anvils are actually technological marvels for their time, and they had a huge impact on the overall anvil industry, and just an absolute ton of them were sold. So going back again, in 1890s or so, there's a guy named David Buel who comes up with a new way to manufacture anvils. So anvils at the time would have been made with a solid wrought iron body and then a high carbon steel faceplate, Swedish steel if you could get it. It was the best steel at the time. But this was a really expensive process. Forging all of this stuff out and you know, it took a lot of tooling, it took a lot of equipment, a lot of experience. And so anvils at the time were selling for 10 to 12 cents a pound, which was reasonably expensive. David Buel is looking at the anvil manufacturing, and he probably worked for either Haybutten or Peter Wright, another anvil company, and he's looking at how they make these anvils and says, we can do this cheaper and faster. There's a lot of expense in the anvil in this base portion of the anvil. What if we take that base portion and instead of forging it out of wrought iron, we cast it? Now they can't do cast steel, that's not going to weld well to wrought iron, but they can do something like a low carbon, a mild steel. And so he applies for a patent in January 25th in 1898. It is eventually granted on August 8th, 1899. But even before that patent is officially submitted, he's already producing some anvils with this new process. And we'll take a look at this anvil. It actually does a really good job of showing it. So he comes up with the idea of, we're going to have a base piece here that can fit multiple anvils in a couple different weights. For example, the number 23 base, which itself weighed 21 pounds, would be used for any anvil in the 45 to 50 pound range. The number 41 base would have been, which weighed 75 pounds, would have been used on any anvil in the 170 to 200 pound range. So they can pre-create all these bases, and then as orders come in, finish up the anvil to match the base. So we cast this bottom base here, and then if we flip it around and we take a look, we can see a line right here. This is the weld line on this anvil where they took this cast steel base, welded on a wrought iron body, which is everything from about here up all the way out, including the step and horn. All of this is wrought iron. And then you can see this line right here where the steel face is welded on. So this anvil and this new process takes 3 separate pieces of steel, welds them together in order to get a finalized product. And this does lead to some kind of interesting things that can happen with the Trenton Anvils. The earlier Trenton Anvils, you know, the pre sort of 1910 ones, 1914 or so, they were selling a lot of these anvils because they were very cheap compared to other anvils. Like I said, the price went from 10 to 12 cents per pound on an anvil in 1895 or so, down to 7.5, 7.25 cents in the Sears catalog in 1901. So they're coming in and undercutting everybody a huge amount and selling a ton of anvils. And what that means is that sometimes they didn't have all the bases for the size of anvils they were selling. And in order to expedite an order, they'd take a base that's one size up or one size down and slap a bigger or smaller than expected anvil top on it. So you might see some Trenton Anvils, those earlier ones, where the base does not seem to be in great alignment with the body of the anvil. And that's because they had these separated bases that they were combining. It also means that you do find some Trenton Anvils that are snapped right through the middle. You very, very rarely see this with any of the other major anvil manufacturers. Haybutten, Peter Wright, really just does not happen on those anvils. But you will see it with these Trentons, where the 2 different types of steel, the wrought iron and the cast steel, didn't have a good weld or become separated somehow, and they pop in half. If that happens, talk whoever you see that has this broken anvil into a good price, pick it up, and you can weld that back together, and you are going to have a perfectly fine anvil. One of these anvils split in half, looks like a major problem, is actually a pretty easy repair because that is how they were forged together originally, was welding them together. And you can do that with modern arc welding and have a beautiful anvil as a result. So we've got David Buel, who comes up with this new process, gets a patent, goes out and talks to some other investors. And in 1898, he forms the Columbus Forge and Iron Company. Actually, I was wrong earlier. The patent was 1898, December 17th. He forms his company on January 25th, applies for a patent a little bit later in the year, and they start manufacturing anvils under this Trenton brand that they got through their agreement with H. Boker and Company. We see the first advertisements with Columbus Forge and Iron Works and the Trenton brand starting in 1901 in the Blacksmith and Wheelwright magazine. And like I said, by 1901, 1903, they are selling these things 7.5 cents a pound, 7.25 cents. And because they are so much cheaper, they make deals with a ton of other vendors and they resell their anvils basically. So looking at this anvil, we can see the classic Trenton triangle on it. This one again, we've got the Trenton triangle. This one says Acme, not Trenton. You will occasionally actually see a Trenton triangle and then another brand slapped on top of it. But this Acme, I believe, is Sears and Roebuck. It is one of probably 20 or 30 different brands that you might see on a Trenton anvil. The way that you can tell it's a Trenton anvil, though, is from a couple distinct characteristics that remained pretty standard throughout their run. One of those is, and we'll take a look at this one, we've got on the bottom kind of this Trenton oval here. Their very earliest anvils, it would come up into the corners a little bit more, sort of an hourglass shape. But early in the 1900s, it moves to this oval shape. That is actually in their advertising as something to look for to identify a Trenton anvil. The other real giveaway on it is all of the Trenton anvils have a weight, and this is in pounds, not hundredweight. So this one says 125 on this foot, and then on this foot, it's going to give you a serial number. You do see weights and serial numbers sometimes on the feet, but weight and then serial number was really only used by Trenton. And that is true on their Trenton branded anvils as well as the non-Trenton branded anvils. And you can look at that serial number and either in Anvils in America, which again, you should buy that book, or I'll post it on my website. There's a chart that you can look at to see, based on the serial number, what year that anvil was manufactured. And we'll do that for all three of these anvils. By 1920, Columbus Forge and Iron Company had sold 176,609 serial numbered Trenton anvils. Like I said, these things were just flying off the shelf. 1920s though, we start seeing more modern industrialization coming in. We get World War I and eventually World War II. And we see a huge shift in the blacksmithing craft. So from about 1900 to 1920, those first 20 years, 176,609 anvils. By the time they go out of business, or not out of business, they stop producing anvils in 1952, they had only sold another 48,952 anvils. So the demand for anvils, and they were the only ones really making wrought iron anvils at that point, just plummeted. It dropped hugely from what it was pre-1920. It is kind of interesting. They were still selling anvils, like I said, into World War II. And this is one of the questions out there that Richard Postman asks in the book, and if anybody knows the answer, I'd love to hear it. The U.S. Army Air Force bought a large number of 25-pound anvils to use on the B-24 Liberator bombers. I can't think of why you would need a 25-pound anvil on a bomber. Hopefully somebody out there knows, but the U.S. Air Force bought a bunch of these to have on their bombers. I don't think they were just dropping the anvils straight on the Germans, so there must have been some other reason for it. We also saw the Army buy a large number of anvils for shoeing mules and things like that. There was still a lot of animal power that was used even into World War II, especially the early parts of it. And in 1946, there apparently were a number of train freight cars loaded with anvils that were purchased by the U.S. Army and through the Lend-Lease program probably shipped over to Russia. And so those later serial number anvils, there's a short supply of them. And part of that reason is a bunch of them wound up in Russia. So I do know that I've got a few Russian people who watch my video. If you are in Russia and you've got one of these Trenton anvils and you can send me some pictures of it, I would love to see some of these anvils that made their way over to help Russia during World War II. In 1952 though, shortly after World War II, Columbus Forge and Iron Company did stop producing anvils. They stayed in business as a forging shop all the way until June of 1982, at which point they eventually went out of business, sold their shop, and a few years later, I believe it was torn down and turned into a parking lot. Sad end to a number of the classic anvil manufacturers, actually. But that's kind of the history of the Trenton anvil. I do have a couple interesting facts about Trenton anvils that I wanted to share. The largest anvil that they made was a 1,200 pound anvil. There is an image, and I'll post this on my website also, of one of those 1,200 pound anvils at the Ohio State Fair in 1910. They did, we believe, sell some more of those, including one of them in 1941 or 1942. Richard Postman was actually able to get the logbooks for a lot of years of Trenton anvil sales, including anvil sizes and everything that they sold. But that 1941-1942 year is missing from the records. But Joseph King, who had the records and had worked there at the time, did remember this 1,200 pound anvil being ordered for a company that produced ships out on the East Coast. Richard Postman says he thinks it's probably still out there. If anybody knows where that 1,200 pound Trenton anvil is, again, I'd love to see it. Post a link, drop me a line, and I would love to include that so people can take a look at it. I think that covers most of the kind of key things about the history of it. Let's take a look at each of these anvils. We'll take a special look at the serial numbers, and we'll compare that to find out what year each of these were made. All right, so we'll take a look at these anvils in order from smallest to largest. This is a 100 pound anvil right here. We can pull it up. We see the 100 pounds, and we see an A101862. A lot of these anvils, especially, again, the earlier ones, are going to be stamped with an A, or sometimes they will be stamped with another letter. If you see something other than an A, what you may actually see is the last letter or last initial of the person who manufactured the anvil. And Richard's book covers a couple of those. Why exactly the early ones were all stamped with an A is unclear. But looking at this 101362, we're going to look in our book here at the serials numbers, and that is between 98,000 and 106,000. So that means that this anvil was produced in 1911. So 100 pound anvil from 1911. Let's move over and take a look at this anvil. And this is actually a really cool anvil. It has stayed in the family that originally purchased this. It came up from the Rio Grande. One of the Smiths here's wife's grandfather bought this anvil and used it down on his place in the Rio Grande. Probably ordered, like I said, from the Sears Roebuck catalog, since it does have that Acme branding on it. And when we look, we can see he put an X in there. That is not part of the normal marking on it as far as I'm aware. We see the 125, we see an A, and then we see 102633, and that is going to put us right there in that same range. Yeah, 102. So this is another 1911 anvil. And we can tell it is a somewhat earlier anvil. All three of these actually have a single hole right here. This is called a handling hole. It was used to help move the anvil around. The very early ones would have more holes around it. A little bit later, 5 years later or so, all those handling holes disappear. I also like the fact that on this anvil you can really see, and it is in spectacular shape, but this is it's wrought iron, right? So where it's been used, it is starting to dish out a little bit. So super cool just seeing the history and that it's all been in the same family. This big one here, 150-pound anvil. Let's flip it up and take a look at that serial number. We see the 150. We see another A. And I look at that and I see, I think, a 117. Maybe that's an 835. That middle number is a little hard to see there. But assuming that is a 117, that is going to put this a couple years later, and this is going to be a 1913 anvil. And actually you see already that handling hole that we saw in the other two anvils is gone on this one, indicating that it is a little bit later anvil. One interesting fact that I did read about these Trenton anvils is when they manufactured these, they actually liked to bend the horn up a little bit so that the tip of the horn was in alignment with the faceplate on the rest of the anvil. Of course, you know, if your horn's made out of wrought iron, doing any sort of substantial work on that horn is going to start bending it down pretty quickly. So if you do see one, you know, the further up this is, more in alignment it is with the faceplate, the more likely that anvil has not seen a lot of forge work being done on it. If that horn is drooping down a little bit, that's an anvil that's got some experience and it's had some work done on it. So, 3 different anvils here, 2 different brandings on it, Acme and Trenton, all made by the same manufacturing company that really transformed how anvils in America were made, and were a key part of making this country really what it is today. If you do have a Trenton anvil out there, I hope you find this video interesting. If you don't have one and you're looking at anvils or interested in the history of them, again, I hope you find this video interesting. Like I said, I will drop a link to my website. I'm going to put a real basic page about Trenton anvils with some of the information that we talked about in this video. But if you really want to know more, again, I can't recommend Richard Postman's Anvils in America book enough. This is, like I continue to say, the definitive guide on anvils, and something any anvil historian or somebody who's interested in the history of anvils should go out and pick up. So, not a lot of forging in this one, but man, everybody loves anvils. So hopefully you like the video. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again.